Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for February 21st, 2022. Hopefully, many of you had a chance to view our conference over the weekend, the Schiller Institute conference on Saturday, on the question. The title was 100 Seconds to Midnight on the Doomsday Clock. We need a new security architecture. This was a quite extraordinary conference coming in the midst of a heightened tension, which could lead to a new war in Europe, even a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. It had two panels. I did the keynote to the first panel, Helga Zepp-LaRouche the keynote to the second panel, and both of us took up a general theme, which was that there's a need to replace the present architecture, which is that of a unipolar world, which is collapsing, which is undergoing a systemic collapse of its economy, a moral collapse, a collapse of trust in government in virtually every country that's represented as part of the transatlantic region. And the unipolar world must now be replaced by one which respects the sovereignty of all nations and defends that sovereignty with a new security architecture. And that's ultimately the second point, is security comes from economic policies that provide mutually beneficial development for all nations and all peoples. In a multipolar world, not dominated by the forces of the usurious City of London and Wall Street, because security ultimately depends on trust that all nations will act together to ensure the highest rates of economic growth and improvement of living standards for the people of all nations. And that is not being served by a unipolar world, which continues in the tradition of the British Empire in terms of looting countries and looting its own populations and enforcing that empire with the military power of the United States and NATO. Now, it's the collapse of that system which is behind the war drive. It's a systemic collapse. The bloated debt structure, the financial bubbles, the holdings of worthless assets by banks that are keeping those assets on their books by fraudulent accounting measures and flows of funds from the Federal Reserve. And the defenders of that order were out in force over the last days. You had Blinken and Biden repeating this view that U.S. intelligence has concluded that Putin made the decision to attack, and that this will happen unless diplomacy works. In other words, unless the threats from the West against Russia convince the Russians not to invade, there will be an invasion. This is the kind of logic which we saw presented at the Munich Security Conference, or it should probably be called the Munich Insecurity Conference. War talk from everyone there except the Chinese. And that included Kamala Harris from the United States, and especially Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. Von der Leyen was advocating harsh sanctions, punishment of Russia, preventing Russia's economic development, and one that would inflict massive damage on the population and the nation. This was backed up by comments made yesterday by Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, who said Russia will be cut off from trading in pounds and dollars, essentially threatening that the Russians will be kicked out of the SWIFT transaction system. And then he said they'll also be cut off from being able to raise funds from the City of London. Now, this echoes what was said in a leak from a national or a U.S. Security conference around January 25th, 26th, where what they said is that the way to stop Russia, not just in Ukraine, but to stop Russia, the threat from Russia, is to prevent access of the Russians to capital and to technology so that Putin cannot modernize his nation. This is the target. The destruction of a Russia which emerged from a previous attempt to destroy it in the 1990s with shock therapy. Russia has come back stronger than before. and now it has an alliance with China. Now, what is their real fear of Russia? Is it that Russia is going to overwhelm Ukraine? Well, Putin says he's not going to. Lavrov, Shoigu, the defense minister, all of them have said they have no intention of invading Ukraine. But there's an attempt to provoke Russia to invade Ukraine so that sanctions can be imposed to destroy the Russian economy. Now, when von der Leyen says cutting off Nord Stream 2 pipeline will punish Russia and make Europe more secure, how is that going to happen? Right now, Europe has gas shortages, not because the Russians aren't delivering, but because of the insane green policy of the European Union. So the fear that's expressed in statements from Biden and Blinken and Boris Johnson and Ursula von der Leyen and Harris and others, what is their fear? It's that the unipolar world is dead. This was the theme of my conference presentation. This was developed in some great detail by Helga Zepp-LaRouche in her presentation, that it cannot survive. Now, interestingly, the tension in the West, the idea of the unity of the NATO powers, is really questionable right now. I did an interview with Alexander Rahr, a business consultant, a historian, an expert on Russia, the research director of the German-Russian Forum, and he made some very interesting points about how the current policy toward Russia and China is based on what he called 20th century diplomacy. It actually goes back to the 19th century. But he said 20th century diplomacy, which is what? British imperial geopolitics, which we have said repeatedly was the cause of World War I and World War II, and if not dropped, if not changed, will be the cause of World War III, which could wipe out the human race. Rahr made the point that there are forces in Europe, including especially in France and Germany, which look to China and Russia as great potential trading partners. There's already a lot of trade between these countries. But the idea of cutting it off because of a hyped up war threat is proof that this has nothing to do with European security, but has everything to do with protecting and preserving a collapsing system. Now, there are efforts underway to try to keep war from happening. There's shooting across the dividing line between Western Ukraine and the Eastern Ukrainian enclaves of Donetsk and Luhansk. It looks as though a false flag is being prepared coming from the West to try to provoke the Russians to intervene to save lives of people in Eastern Ukraine. Now, if that doesn't provoke a war, the question is, how do you stop that? This would be a Minsk II, or actually the enforcement of the original Minsk agreement. Also, there's a proposal now for a series of upcoming meetings. Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov will be meeting on February 24th, as Blinken said, if Russia hasn't invaded before then. And they're possibly setting up a summit meeting between Biden and Putin. Macron also spoke with Putin, with Biden and Zelensky yesterday, and what they're discussing is a diplomatic solution. But a diplomatic solution means you have to get rid of NATO. You have to get rid of the unipolar security architecture and replace it with one which does represent the interests of all sovereign nations. The war talk right now is to a large extent designed to take people's attention in the Western world, in the transatlantic world, from the fact that the economy is collapsing. In fact, if they go with these sanctions, which end up cutting off energy supplies to Western Europe, the collapse will be blamed on Russia. So it's these self-fulfilling prophecies in defense of a unipolar order, which are the greatest threat to people in the Western world. So I would recommend watch our Saturday conference. You can get it at theschillerinstitute.com. You can also get the interview I did with Alexander Rahr at theschillerinstitute.com, because what we're presenting are solutions, not bluster and ideology. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll be back again tomorrow.